Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. What a gift it is today to welcome Dr. Vincent Bacote as our guest on Conversing. He'll be a returning guest, and he comes to us this time in relationship to a film that he has helped mastermind and produce that's called Black Evangelical. It's a documentary that we're going to have a chance to explore. For those of you who don't know Dr. Bacote, I want to just be sure that you understand his context. He serves as professor of theology at Wheaton College and is the director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics. He's written a number of books, the most recent one of which is called Reckoning with Race and Performing the Good News, in Search of a Better Evangelical Theology. He's a widely cited commentator and a person whose life and work I have particularly admired. Vince, it's so great to have you here.
Oh, really glad to be talking with you.
You know, I do see you as a faculty member at Wheaton as a person who occupies a really complicated role that is actually inherent in the film that we're here to talk about. And you know that journey far better than I do. So give us a bit of your narrative. How did you even come to Christian faith? How did your faith develop? How did it intersect with white evangelicalism? And then how did it ultimately bring you to Wheaton? And then most specifically, why this film and why now?
Sure. I grew up in Maryland, going to Shiloh Baptist Church of Glenarden, Maryland, which I only learned after I was 35 was a national and progressive Baptist church. All I knew was that it was Shiloh Baptist. There was nothing in the Sunday program that said what kind of Baptist we were.
It's hidden in the fine print.
Yeah. And so I was sensitive to spiritual realities pretty early on in my life. And, around age 10 is probably when I would say I confessed the faith, a sinner's prayer type of thing, even though I probably believed it like 2 or 3 years before that. So arguably I may have been a Christian already. It was kind of like the official, public
the moment,
declaration. Yeah. And, joined the church, etc. I go to college at the Citadel, the military college of South Carolina. That's what that hat is over there.
Right.
And there I was, from the time I was a freshman, involved with the parachurch group, the Navigators. And what I did not know that I was stepping into was an evangelical parachurch organization. And again, without knowing it, I'd had some exposure to people that were evangelical because on television, for example, I'd seen the John Ankerberg show, which had people on it that I didn't know would be some of the people at the seminary I went to when I went to Trinity Divinity School. So I just knew that it was this religious show that came on late in the evening. And so I go to the Citadel. Very formative for me to be part of that Navigators experience. I would say also, to the credit of my Navigator leader there, he thought it was important for me, the Navigators had these things called summer training programs. He thought it was important for me to go to one that was predominantly African-American. And so the summer of my sophomore year, I went to Memphis, Tennessee to be part of one of those programs. Had one of the biggest, moments in terms of growth in my faith that summer. One of those things where it's really grasping that, the totality of life was to be directed by God. It wasn't that I didn't try to be a moral person, but it was more like, back then I would think I was a person who wanted to be dedicated to God, but still, I kind of called the shots or planned my life out and then wanted God to make the plan happen. And, it was then recognizing that hey, you're like the one in the driver's seat and I'm not the co-pilot, I'm the passenger. And my life belongs to you, to be directed by you, etc. So it was such a big transformation. I wondered at one point whether it was really my conversion. Now I would definitely say it wasn't. It was just one of those growth moments. And so that was, I really appreciate my Navigator leader saying that you should go to that kind of program rather than these other Navigator programs that I thought were cool, but they've been predominantly white. And I should say, by the way, I'm a very culturally fluid person. And so I've probably been fine at one of those other programs, but I'm so glad that I went to these others. And to some degree, I think even that first summer, there might have been the occasional circumstance where I got some sense of the tension about some African Americans with the evangelical movement. Now, had I heard the word evangelical by that point, I'm not sure I had. But looking back, I was definitely part of that. I mean, that's when I begin to get introduced to, I started learning about figures like Francis Schaeffer, or learning about, the standard people on the Christian radio types of things. People are talking about, oh, this preacher or that preacher, Chuck Swindoll or whoever. And so I'm the Navigators all 4 years at the Citadel. I wound up going back to Memphis after I graduated to live with the Navigator staff guy that I had gotten to know in Memphis. And he was over the African American ministry at what was then Memphis State, now University of Memphis. And it's interesting thinking about the fact that they had decided at Memphis State to have a Navigators ministry, because there was a white leader and there was an African American leader. And it's at one point they decided to, okay, we'll have collective meetings, but also there was a point where they decided to have separate meetings, at certain points. And then they would get together at certain points together at the big group, but they would have these separates otherwise. And, and I think there were a lot of, I didn't know what the background was of that. It was just something that I observed. While being in Memphis, I was listening to Christian radio all the time. So definitely beginning to hear the word evangelical somewhere in there. And, hearing all the usual suspects on Christian radio. So Swindoll, Charles Stanley, John MacArthur, James Dobson. I had no idea actually how dominated it was, by the way, by dispensational theology, because almost everybody was some version of a dispensationalist. Not everyone, but most of them. But I do remember, and this is one of the where the tensions emerged, was wondering why, like on Focus on the Family, in some of the programs, they would start talking about abortion, or they'd be talking about the Cold War. This is late 80s. And I remember wondering when people were going to say anything about race. And by the way, this is with me not being the person that wanted to bring stuff up about race. I was not that guy. There were other people who might say things, and I would tend to be skeptical if somebody said something. I think it's about race. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. It might be some other reason, etc. But I think that's one of the places where I began feeling some of those tensions. 1990, I go to Trinity Divinity School to get my MDiv, at the time thinking that, at least when I got there, the plan was to be a pastor. Before that year was over, I was already on the path towards my main sort of command central being in the context of a professor, and out of that doing teaching, preaching, etc. While there, Riley Washington was a graduate of Trinity, and he was also doing some adjunct teaching there. He and Glenn K. Ryan wrote this book, Breaking Down Walls, about racial reconciliation. So this is like 91, 92. And I remember thinking, because even before getting to Trinity, I was wondering this: how do you have these Bible people understand and see that matters of race are not optional, that this is something that we should care about? And the thing was that I felt that because of my formation and because of the way that people tended to make arguments about, being biblical, that you had to have almost a kind of exegetical or theological kind of proof texting where, you had to find where literally the thing called racism was in the Bible. Because, what seemed to be the reason for any kind of ethical imperative was God says X, you should do X. And so when Raleigh Washington had worked on this thing from Ephesians 2 about reconciliation, about this being where we see why it's a requirement for Christians, I remember wondering, are people going to buy this? And No, and actually, I didn't really hear any pushback about it, but I wondered because, I just felt like, it was almost like I felt like the bar was super high and to get people to really buy this. Now, what also was going on at the time, so eventually Spencer Perkins and Chris Rice write a book. Eventually Bill Pannell, after the Rodney King riots, writes the book, The Coming Race Wars. So I start wondering about a variety of things. One thing I was wondering was there weren't a whole bunch of us who were minorities at Trinity, and I wondered why there weren't more of us. That became the reason. That became the pathway to the first article that I wrote about evangelicals or the lack of them, or Black evangelicals, right, at these institutions. So it was something about being an urban mission. So I, interviewed. That's how I first got in contact with Bill Pannell. He's one of the people I interviewed for that article. So I met Harold Dean Trulier. I had met Carl Ellis before that, actually before going to Trinity, and interviewed a bunch of people for that. And so what was starting to happen, looking back, is that I was trying to figure this thing out, because the vexation for me probably was this. Okay, I'm among people who are the Bible people. And it seemed to me that if the Bible people ought to be the people that are leading the way on questions of race, rather than people that either are not making that as prominent, or even people that aren't Christians being the ones that are leading the way on race. And I couldn't understand why it wasn't happening among the Bible people, or wasn't happening a lot. And so I was wondering about that. I would probably say the place where a lot of that wondering got combined with vexation was when I went to Geneva College for a conference that was to honor Bill Bentley. It was about Black Evangelicals. Bill Bentley died about a month before that, I think. And so I went to that conference. So Pannell was there, Tom Skinner was there, Carl H. Henry was there, J. Dennis Roberts was there, Tony Evans was there, Eugene Rivers was there, Carl Ellis was there, Clarence Hilliard was there. I mean, tons of people. And I remember at that conference, a number of people naming their frustrations and tension. And I didn't know what their experiences had been in the 60s, 70s, 80s up to that point. And it wasn't that everybody was saying a plague in your house about institutional evangelicalism, but a lot of them had had significant dissonance. And I remember writing back with people with whom I carpooled there. And Carl H. Henry had given one of the final addresses on the last day. And I remember somebody saying that they thought that Carl Henry was paternalistic. And I remember the guy I was driving said, and yeah, he was. And I remember thinking, well, I didn't think Carl H. Henry was paternalistic with what he said. Now, and part of it was, I'm showing up at the conference as a person who's thinking about possibility, but also thinking about these people are there, et cetera. It'd be interesting to learn about this. And I had interviewed some of these people. And so I'm trying to think about, again, possibilities for the evangelical movement to be this thing that can get to this place of leading the way or becoming prominent, paying attention to this. And then there are people who are clearly articulating their penchants. In fact, I remember Pannell saying at one point, I don't need Kenneth Contzer telling me what to do. And now, you're having no bill. I mean, now it's like, right. Of course. I can just, it totally makes sense, right? But the point is that, so for me, one of the things that wound up happening is that I had forgotten about until we started even thinking about the title of the film. At TEDS, we had a student paper, and I had become a person who kind of wrote regular editorials. And after going to that conference at Geneva College, I wrote an article called Black and Evangelical, an Uneasy Tension, ? Because I felt it in a way that I had not there, because I wasn't as agitated.
Right. And predisposed.
Yeah. And again, I'm trying to think about, look, the evangelical movement, if you can just get people to see this thing, almost like if you can find the right methodology, if you can put the right thing in front of people, we're the Bible people. We believe this. We'll do this. Looking back, I would say what I was coming to understand, but didn't understand as greatly, was that though the commitments of the evangelical movement are this biblicism and at least a stated openness to and hence subjection to the Bible in its totality, it's not merely a movement whose motivations are strictly just tell me what the Bible says. That it also exists in a time and a place and a context, and that there were contextual realities. In other words, the evangelical movement being not just a biblical movement, but being a social, cultural movement, etc. And those social and cultural realities obviously informed how people were looking at the Bible, how people were applying the Bible, or how people are maybe unaware of certain things in the Bible because maybe there are blind spots that they have. And then, of course, obviously other formational things where some people might have just imbibed a kind of presumption about, well, things are pretty good, and as long as we have these other the political commitments that we do have, because that it was still a lot of tension about whether you should even be involved in politics in the early 90s. At least we have these commitments. Let's not get too caught up in this. And so I was starting to learn, I would say, about all of that. And so, I go through my doctoral program, wind up here at Wheaton, and started here in January of 2000. And one of the things that I didn't want to do, either in my doctoral program or in my early years at Wheaton, is, I didn't want to be the person who was pigeonholed by attending the race. Now, as it happens, my dissertation figure was a Dutch Calvinist, and I did care about, big picture anyway, a theology that expresses itself ethically, or a public theology, or a public theology with political implications, social, cultural implications, etc. That makes race one of the things you have to talk about. But even though race is one of the things to talk about, I didn't want that to be the main thing I talked about or the only thing I talked about.
Right.
Because and part of it was I didn't want to be, if you will, captured by being only doing that, as if to talk about that means it's the only thing I can talk about.
Right.
And so being an expert on this Dutch Calvinist and public theology and that kind of stuff, I mean, and it wasn't that was an intentional strategy. I mean, because those concerns show up in every tradition.
Yes.
And among every ethnicity about the whole public engagement piece. So to me, that was just something big picture to address. But eventually, I mean, the road to this documentary happens because I'm out at Fuller in 2008. There's a small group of us, like maybe 15 to 20 of us, at a meeting called the Obsidian Society. We met in the Guest Center, and Ron Potter was there, who I'd met at that 93 conference in Geneva College. And his color commentary through that weekend together indicated to me that he basically had all of Black evangelicalism inside his head. I mean, Ron had read a lot. He was like a walk-in library. And I knew that it would be great for people to get this information because good luck, even now, still, even though there's more stuff written, we're not overrun. We haven't experienced an avalanche of content about Black evangelicals. And so to me, it was important to say, okay, this information just needs to be captured. That was the initial idea. It goes from just wanting to capture it to making a documentary. Now that's, how does that happen between 2008 and 2025? It happens because, well, one, nothing happened until 2021. Then finally, we brought Ron to campus here. By that point, Christianity Today had become a partner. And even after the first interview, and then a year later interviewing Pinnell at Fuller, a documentary wasn't necessarily what Ed Gilbert and I from CT at the time were thinking. It was, how do we have this information and kind of create some way to communicate it? When we get connected with Dan Long, a Fuller alumnus, and we start talking about doing more interviews and stuff, a lot of our conversations turned to, how do you tell this story? And it turned into a documentary. And so one interview turned into 24, and there's approximately 40 hours of footage. I mean, most of the interviews were at least 2 hours. At least a couple of them were longer. And now we have a 94-minute documentary that is about that tension that I had named in 1993, I think it was. Funny thing about that is I had forgotten that I'd written that newspaper article until my wife happened to be cleaning up some stuff and happened to pull out that newspaper article. And I was like, oh my gosh, look at this.
Isn't that amazing?
Because I was like, that's what we're talking about in this documentary, because it's about that in-between experience.
So giving it a slightly wider lens, then, you're having this experience that you've just narrated, which is an expression of your own, in a certain way, non-racial engagement in that classical, let's say 60s, 70s, 80s kind of way. That was not the strain that you were in as a person in culture, fluid culturally, as you said. And then you begin to notice something as your experience, partly through Navigators and partly through the circle of people that you then you become more self-conscious about being aware of. And they're not really tapping into what is really a much bigger, wider cultural conversation that's already fully inflamed about issues of race, but has not really intersected that much, it doesn't sound like, with your own sense of burden. But your own sense of burden starts growing as you start realizing its dramatic absence from so many of the spaces that you were in. Is that a
I think
fair
that
way
is
of...
fair, because even though, well, I guess there's two things. One, I remember reading, I think before I went to TEDS, the book, it was updated, called What Color Is Your God? The Columbus Sally Ronald Bean book that I think had initially been called Your God Is Too White. And so that was a book that was maybe 150 pages. But there just wasn't a lot of stuff.
Right.
And so at one level, there was the whole question of, well, what's there? Then there was the question of, who's out there?
Right.
Because I didn't know everything was out there. Now, in 1987, 1988, there were these two big conferences in Atlanta, Destiny 87, then Atlanta 88. And you had a lot of people, whether they would all call themselves evangelicals, I guess is the question. But, a lot of people from parachurch world, pastors, some people involved in missions. And so and I didn't get, because of my job, I couldn't attend either of them. And so, but you're talking like 40, 50 people, all these pictures of people say, oh, I didn't know who Crawford Loritz was, or El Bordellas, or any of those people until I saw their pictures in that. And I think that's also maybe how I learned who E.V. Hill was. And so I began to know that there were more people out there, but I was also wondering, okay, where are these people? What's the range of places these people are in? And I also certainly noticed that there was hardly anyone who does what I do for a living right now. Hardly anybody was teaching theology or biblical studies at seminaries. If they were there, often they were in homiletics, missions, or something like that. And if you did find theologians or biblical scholars, they'd be like in an HBCU seminary or a mainline seminary. And so I was trying to sort all that out,
One of the things that the film explores quite a lot is this sense of Black consciousness. We'll come back to that in a broader way in a moment. But I'm curious, what would you have said about your emerging Black consciousness personally? Was your Blackness becoming more of a fact and a reality, or more vividly present in your life? How would you describe that?
Okay, I'm born in 1965. One of my earliest childhood memories is my mom and my uncle taking me and my older brother to see RFK's train go by. I hear language about integration, color blindness, from Black and white people. And so the idea is that which basically then orients you to understand that yes, that there's racial prejudice, etc., but really, most of the bad actors are like Klansmen and Nazis, and that's not most people. And so if the goal was this society that, looking back, winds up being kind of Gnostic about ethnic particularity, at least that's what's stated. Yes. Never mind the fact that somebody's culture is always calling the shots. But at the time, I didn't recognize that. It was like, oh, hey, we just have this kind of benign Americanist culture or whatever, right? And so, I always knew that there were racist people, et cetera. And I knew I was a Black person. But I also, again, I think my cultural fluidity and the fact that I had very few things happen to me because of being an African American. But those things, whether they insulated me or just the way my life was, I didn't think about, what I would say now is that if you hardwire into the United States into the middle of the 1960s by law, antagonism to African Americans by law, slavery than Jim Crow, you don't get revival by legislation. You don't get a sweeping transformation of everyone's disposition because now you say by law there's equality of opportunity of those things. But I think there was a way that it was kind of articulated in terms of maybe perhaps what was hoped for, that because of being articulated in terms of that hope, it would disincline me from being the kind of person that would say, we need to talk a lot about this. We need to talk, we just find some way more to talk about this way of living together. And so I think, in fact, I can remember literally talking to the person that became my advisor at Trinity, probably the year before I came, that I was starting to have to think about these things. And he said, your consciousness is being raised, is what he said. Because I had to think about the fact that, well, no, actually the reason some people are doing things is because, explicitly or implicitly, race is a factor. And I didn't want to believe it was a factor. And I had to believe it was a factor. And I mean, even recently, I didn't know it, but, somebody that taught me, and it was fine, one of my classes at Trinity, another prof told me that this prof said to him, this is a white prof, that when his daughter was going out with a black guy, that he starts talking about whether this should work. It was clear that he had this sense of, it's better for us to just be separate. And there's no way you could have told me, having any classes with this guy, that I would have ever thought that he had that view.
Right.
The point being that, I think I was starting to understand that, no, actually, there are people who believe these things.
Right.
So,
and that to some degree, you had been living in what sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, what sounds like a racially optimistic position.
That's a great way to put it. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Where it was just like, yes, it's true, but it's not a big deal. And the movement is moving forward and there's been progress. And I seem to be not particularly feeling any great racial trauma from being Black. So therefore, you could write a scenario that doesn't really take Black trauma or suffering as a personal experience. And perhaps I think it's overstated beyond that. Is that
very true. And even though the tension was ratcheting up about why evangelicals aren't saying anything about this, or they hardly say anything about it, or if they do say anything about it, it's only by personal prejudice. That optimism factors into how I was thinking, well, if I just show you what it is, because of what you say your commitments are, we'll move into this. And then, of course, what's beginning to happen in the early 90s, and we talk about this a little bit in the documentary, what's beginning to happen in the 90s, and as I get to go on to Drew for my PhD, this and Promise Keepers is emerging, like 90, 91, 92. By the time I get to Ted's, McCartney had made racial reconciliation a central plank. It seems like, people are actually talking about this. And I didn't know, by the way, that about all the sort of personal capital that McCartney was spending to do this. And the interesting thing is that though he was spending that capital, part of the challenge of what he had of his vision was that for that vision to happen, you needed something other than bringing people together and articulating it and hoping that there'll be a big move of God that will then kind of take care of the rest.
Right.
That you need the grinding work of people living life together and knowing each other and being patient with each other and, being long on patience and recognizing that misunderstanding is going to be, on the menu a whole lot, and that to move forward and to have life together requires so much work and so much liberation from whether it's fear or other motivations that would make it hard for people to actually live together. I remember learning maybe 22, 23 years ago that there have been a lot of studies. Somebody done some studies about intentional multi-ethnic churches, because people were starting to try to do that in the 90s for sure. I mean, they'd been even trying it in the 60s and 70s, and that most of them failed. And in fact, it reminds me when I interviewed J. Robertson McQuilkin, who'd been president of Columbia Bible College and Seminary. One, I remember him telling me that early on in the early 1960s, when they decided to admit somebody who was Black, somebody quit the board. I remember him telling me that, I think in terms of his experience of how hard it was for people to live together, he said what sometimes some of my relatives said after having integration for a while. They go, sometimes I think it's just better for us to have our own spaces. So it wasn't only white people talking about this. But it was interesting that he named that. And to me, I think that sometimes that there was a kind of despairing, or was and is for some people, a despairing of possibilities of people actually having the committed life together to do that work.
Right.
And obviously there are, I think, genuine multi-ethnic churches, but genuine versus surface level multi-ethnic churches, I think, is a interesting contrast.
That are still fundamentally monocultural,
yes.
even if they
yes.
have
yes.
a diverse
yes.
constituency. I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. At the beginning of the film, it opens with some really strong words from Tom Skinner, whose appearance is throughout the book. Why don't you just briefly say who Tom Skinner is, and then I want to have you interact with me about some of his opening words.
Sure. So Tom Skinner was a singular figure. So he was somebody who got converted from gang life to being an evangelist in New York. He becomes a kind of Black Billy Graham figure in the mid to late 1960s. He eventually has his own parachurch organization called Tom Skinner Associates. Bill Pannell worked with him. And he is the person that gives an address at Urbana in 1970 that was a turning point for a lot of people. And when he's also one of these people, he's a paradigm for what a lot of people experience. So he's on the one hand, he's like that figurehead person, and that figurehead person who winds up being persona non grata when he begins to get, quote unquote, too political.
Which meant talking about issues of race and justice.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And so his radio program gets taken away from Moody taken off Moody, and he has some personal crises in the 70s. I would say he's kind of back in active ministry in the 80s. So he gives the closing address at Atlanta 88, where, one of the lines I think is really interesting, because I think it's hard for people to recognize this. He said, to be for Black people is not to be like against somebody else. But it is to be for yourself. To be for yourself is not to be seeking, in a zero-sum way, the denigration or to have hostility toward others.
Right.
And I think, that remains for some people a big challenge to understand that attention to particularity is not necessarily about who gets to set the borders on the basis of particularity.
Right.
And I think that there are people who think that if you mention it, then you must be wanting to kind of say, "Oh, I want to be in charge now because you were in charge." There are other options besides those.
Right.
So, he's this incredible orator, and again, I say singular figure because there are some people, they show up, and when they're talking, stuff just happens. And he was one of those people. He's one of those people. There's no question about it. So And so he was one of the prominent leaders in, among Black evangelicals, and, dies at age 52. I'd
Mm,
forgotten how young he was
mm.
till I
As
looked it
it
up.
gets closer to our own ages,
Yes,
I'm
yeah.
I'm now long beyond
I'm
that
beyond it
number.
now
But
too, yeah. And
yeah,
but he was someone who was uniquely capable of communicating, the faith. And then, he moves from just giving your sort of standard evangelical conversion narrative type of story and inviting people into a personal narrative like that for themselves. He moves towards a more holistic articulation of the faith, where it's not just about, sort of this vertical transaction, but or that when you only talk about the horizontal dimensions, you're talking about personal piety, that it had to be more than personal piety, that it also needs to be actual social, political transformation. And that winds up creating complications for him.
so as the film says, it's just exactly on the point you were just making. He arrives as a certain kind of almost trope in evangelical circles because he
Yes.
can fit the conversionary narrative. Everybody loves that. It's the great story of the violent gang leader who comes to faith in Christ and whose life and character is really radicalized and utterly changed and turned upside down by that. Then he begins to gain a platform, but his platform begins to change as he begins to develop further his understanding of this holistic gospel that you were just referring
Yes.
to. And as that happened, then people who had initially received his ministry with great ease, and here I'm specifically referring to white evangelicals, who really welcomed his early proclamation and evangelism, then began to struggle harder and harder
Yeah.
over the fact that he was saying uneasy, unconventional white truths. So at the
Yeah.
opening of Black plus Evangelical, there's this moment where he's preaching, Tom Skinner, that is, and he's making some very strong statements about the fact that the one of the major questions that people of color and white Christians as well need to consider is, what is the relationship between God and, as he's describing it, blackness in particular.
Yeah.
And he says, and strongly, and everything he said was very strong, but one of the things he said that was strong was this sense that people who are white and evangelical needed to understand that being Black evangelicals did not mean being a white evangelical in blackface.
Oh yeah. That's
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
What a scorcher line.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
touche. I mean, we're still living on the vortex of that sentence right there.
Yeah.
And so much of what is happening in the tragic landscape, as I see it, of so much of American evangelicalism is the fact that that fundamental question of the relationship between God and race, God and blackness in particular, and evangelicalism not being about something that should be passed on to blacks so that they can be black-faced evangelicals of a white soulish kind.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's true.
Is still the great conundrum. And it lies near the core, as I see it, of so many of the other things that are still unfolding in ways that have never really been worked through. And so much of the overwhelming racism in our country that's been exposed, not new, but further exposed, is palpable. And a lot of it is related to forms of white evangelicalism.
Unfortunately, yeah. I think it winds up being related to it to the extent that people say, I want to be this biblical evangelical, and I'm in a way unwilling to have the Bible that I say that I'm committed to interrogate all of my commitments. That winds up creating the problem of those commitments being unchecked.
Yes.
And when those commitments are unchecked, a person just thinks, well, I just want to be a good American.
Right.
But also what it means is that if you haven't had to attend the horror movies about what's gone wrong in this country around race, in other words, you can have a certain narrative about it, but it's a narrative that says, well, we pass laws. We don't traffic in the slave trade anymore. Jim Crow's illegal. There's nothing else to talk about. When anybody with a family knows that in a family, sometimes you go, well, what's the problem in our family? Well, we never talk about why we're the way that we are because of stuff that happens. And so you wind up with a desire for a conspiracy of silence to have, well, I heard like a counselor once say, there's the phrase peace at any price. But the price that's being paid is an insufficient community in terms of people really relating to each other and being able to relate to each other truthfully, not for the purpose of people being hostile, but in order for the community to really be as whole as it can be. And to do that, you have to, like, honestly, in any close relationship, you have to at some point be willing to learn things about yourself. In fact, often what I like to do when I'm talking about race to students, or not just students, but in other settings, I'll use marriage as an example. And I'll say, if you want to be married to somebody, it's like you're marrying somebody from another country. And if you want that marriage to be a good marriage, it's not going to be a good marriage if you decide that the only thing that somebody needs to do is just conform to you. Or if you are unwilling to learn a lot of things about yourself and you only want the other person to do the learning. And I think a version of that happens around this because, it's actually a massively complicated thing because the experience of African Americans in the United States is all over the place. Some people have all kinds of stuff that they've gone through and they've got all the receipts, so to speak, about race. Other people, they've managed to have minimal suffering. And they might not be in situations where they've had to think a lot about it. And so, but if somebody thinks that to talk about race is only to believe that it's one or the other of these experiences, they are not taking the time to do the learning about the difference and complexity of and diversity of Black experience that there is.
Right.
And the diversity of Black Christianity that there is. And if people are not willing to do that, and they will say, can't we just all talk about something else? So what's easy for you to talk about if it's not bothering you. But if people that you say you want to be part of your family, if you really want them to be part of your family, you can't say the price of being part of this family is some things you talk about, other things you must be party of a conspiracy of silence. That will wind up being unhelpful for, if God's people of the church are supposed to be, if anybody's supposed to be doing this, it ought to be the people of God. And if God's people are unwilling to do it, then what are we saying is more important to us than being that kind of people who are growing those difficult things?
Right. And what is the gospel that we think explains those two alternatives?
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And I do think that one of the great points of anguish for so many that underlies the whole film is this sense of tension between, on the one hand, wanting to share a common biblical faith, as Christ-centeredness, a conviction about our fundamental spiritual condition and our need for God to redeem and rescue and remake us. Okay, a lot of that internal story could be roughly parallel or largely overlapping between Black churches and white evangelical churches.
Yeah.
And yet once we start then moving into the area of discipleship, where faith is now actually meant to be transformative to the whole of our being, to the whole of our perceptions, to the whole of our world and our relationships and our priorities, where then I'm meant to enter into a communion of unlike people who do not share my specific sociology or my race, who, for example, therefore, are now invited, and I'm invited to join them in a common family, as you've just been teasing out. And the consequences of that is that we don't get to say, just as you've been saying, it's just going to be the white way. If you're going to join this family, then become white, and then it's fine with us if you're also Black. But instead, it's a completely different kind of story where there's a mutuality and interdependence and understanding and repentance and growth and sorting that has to happen that reframes our understanding of ourselves and our neighbor in light of the grace and mercy and love of God and in light of the inherent human dignity of every human being.
Yes.
And when you look back, I think, for example, of Jamar Tisby's book, The Color of Compromise, a fairly recent book, a bestseller, that was really trying to almost just lay out the way that the architecture of racism was built into so much of the American story, which is, of course, being denied on lots of levels by our government and others. But that narrative is still the narrative that's being lived. And therefore, the question of how do you take the most biblicized form of Protestant America and you marry it to the Bible and public faith, and then you have to inherently bring in issues of race and ethnicity. You can either set up, as you were saying earlier, a simple binary paradigm. It's going to be this way or it's going to be that way. Or you set it up in a much truer and more faithful way, which is it's going to be a rich variety of people who come from different contexts in which we are knit together, not because we are so like or because our experience is the same, but because of the way that we are knit together in Christ, through Christ. And that work is the hard work of ongoing daily relationship, conversation, arguments, failure, disappointment, disillusionment, despair, and also hope and love and the possibility of reconciliation and renewal. And what I found so gripping about this film is that this is so clearly and beautifully explained by the whole variety of people that you got to be interviewed for this program, who, as Black Christians, trying to explain exactly how this is played for them and why it has been and is still so problematic is really, it's just very sobering. Like, we still have to do this. And the answer is absolutely we have to do this.
Yes.
Like, this is a first order work. This is not second order work. And it's protracted work. And white people don't get to say, I'm just tired of talking about race. Can't people who are people of color get over their race? It's the most nonsensical statement. So I guess the film to me has a sober hope to it. And
that's a good way to put it.
And I wonder if you could tease out what you think that sober hope is.
Sure. And I'm glad you brought that up, because the goal of the documentary is not to be a kind of hit piece about the evangelical movement. It's really to say, if you're going to tell the story of the church, these people are part of the story of the church. And their experience is an experience that some people are experiencing now, and they don't know about that experience. And we want them to know about it. Or we want people who identify with that experience to know about it, and we want the broader church to know about it. We actually want the whole world to know about it, whether they're Christians or not.
Right.
But I especially want people to see that people who've gone through this do not then find themselves just in what I like to call a wilderness of complaint.
Right.
They are people who remain committed to the mission of the church, to growing in their life with God.
Right.
And some of them are in a place like me, in a place like Wheaton. A lot of them are elsewhere. But the point is, they're still committed to the life of the church, this global gospel, and they're going to use their agency towards being these emissaries of hope, if you will, without hope being something that mutes the realism that people who have had some kind of interface with evangelical institutions, minorities have had that interface, for a lot of them, that interface has included, if you will, going through some things. Going through some, I say there's a 4-stage thing. I don't name that 4-stage thing specifically in the documentary, but you experience it. It is people come into it, they're delighted by learning all this stuff about the Bible. They're distressed when they discover that there's socio-political complications. That distress moves to, actually, I'm sorry, it's dissonance at first. Then they move to distress, where they ramp, where the dissonance gets tightened like a spring because of the socio-political complications. And then they get to a place of decision where they're going to decide whether or not I'm going to be a part in this place or go somewhere else. And I want people to understand that going through those phases and getting to a decision phase, the decision does not mean that realism requires you to only complain or point about what's wrong, but that realism allows you to have honesty, but also because you're a gospel person, you don't forget that the good news is the greatest news of all, and you have experienced it and that you can embody it. To embody it does not require you to deny what's gone wrong, but that's not the only truth. The truth is also there's possibility for you to participate and in the work of the church and to see the good news in action from individual to socio-cultural, socio-political ways.
Right.
And so that possibility is there, and it's very important for us to do that. And that includes, this line that we have at the very end where Bill Pannell says, evangelicals basically have to bring their entire selves to it. In other words, you can't be this good news person if this good news means erasing yourself.
Right.
It's a strange thing if none of us says this way in the documentary, but it's like, think about it this way. Jesus identifies with the human race. He identifies with the created order. In doing that identity, the identification, that's reaffirming God's created goodness in this world and in the diversity of that created goodness. And salvation is not about muting that. It's really about, as Walter McRae says, God will take it and elevate it. Not elevate it to idolatry, but to ways that glorify him by seeing the way that it contributes, just as other ethnic particularities contribute to, showing, God's creativity, showing that God has not abandoned this world, and showing that God's going to eventually completely transform all of this. That's still opportunity and possibility that we have. And I think it's unfortunate that sometimes people experience participating in evangelical spaces or sometimes in other spaces, and involvement seems to be, please be a part of us, but make sure you leave a part of yourself outside.
Right.
When the funny thing about that is that, look, God wants all of us. He wants the entirety of who we are. And he wants to take that, transform it, and he wants us to show what that can be. Which doesn't mean muting it. It means the proper expression of it. And so that's still a possibility for people. So it is a sober hope, because to do that, when all around us people create different kinds of idolatries of identity about different dimensions of particularity, it's so easy for people to assume that because you can talk in a positive way about your ethnic identity, it's the presumption that you talk positively must mean that you're trending towards an idolatry of identity. Right? But that's not, again, the only way that this can go. And so it's part of the opportunity, really, of living into this hope and helping people to see that I can, as A.G. Miller says, be a proud Black man and keep seeing how Black I am. But to do that doesn't mean I'm taking away anything from you. Doesn't mean I'm threatening you.
It's not a zero-sum game.
Exactly. But zero-sum games are easier for people to make sense of.
Yes. Well, let me just say to our listeners how grateful I am for this film and for the way that it distills and actually captures that original intention of your filming, captures the storytelling of voices that we dare not be unacquainted with, and I hope actually in some measure can become saturated with, because I feel like, how many times have I listened to Tom Skinner's 1970 Urbana sermon? I bet I've listened to it 20 times. And every single time I listen to it, I feel challenged and inspired and reminded and grounded and hopeful. And I just hope that those who have an opportunity to see this film, you can find it free online. The link is in the notes. will really take it to heart. And you might even think of using it as a small group experience together, to watch it together, discuss it together, and to commit to the long work of what taking this kind of subject seriously really involves. I want to say thank you to Black people who have, in one way or another, been willing to identify with white evangelicalism, because frankly, white evangelical needs all the help it can get. And and the tolerance and patience, the resilience of many Black people who have lived and suffered inside as a part of white evangelicalism, including you, is no small thing. It's actually a really substantial thing. And surely the work that the body of Christ is meant to do is work that moves ever more deeply into this direction, not as an ideology, as a reflection of the reality of God's love and creativity and hope for what this unique new communion is actually meant to be to the world. So, Vince, thank you so much for being the person that's behind this documentary, for all the people who contributed to it, and for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be part of it. And I appreciate your responsiveness to the film. I appreciate, our friendship. I appreciate the way you're helping us to see the different ways that it resonates. And I certainly want to encourage everybody to just take time to take in the story and to share it with others, because, the story of the church is huge. And this is a part of the story of the church that is worth hearing. And it's informative, it's challenging, and it's inspiring. And it will resonate with all of us in different ways, because we all bring the unique complex of our own experiences to it. But it's an opportunity for people to really see that evangelical can really mean better news than you thought.
Amen. 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 Thank you.
Thank you.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.